Obsolescence is defined as the process of becoming obsolete or outdated and no longer used. Old-fashioned versus newfangled. Especially in today's world, shiny objects get the attention, but this also creates an ever-increasing amount of obsolete things. Sometimes innovation even makes certain jobs obsolete. What do we do with all these things now that are just left around? Are we too quick to call something not useful anymore just because it's not the newest thing? Think on this and formulate some questions of your own as we launch out onto the loop and discuss the implications of obsolescence on Curiosity Continuum.
Hey everybody, this is Josh. Thank you for joining us today on Curiosity Continuum. For those of you tuning in for the first time, Curiosity Continuum is a podcast and movement started by two lifelong friends who want to spark your curiosity, help you integrate information, enhance your everyday contextual awareness in a constantly changing world. We're going to do this by sharing conversations with you that explore, examine, and reframe common practical topics.
And CuriosityContinuum.com is our website HQ. That has all the links to be able to listen to us on all the major platforms, follow us on our social media, and most importantly, make sure you interact and rate us on your favorite platforms. That helps to find new audiences for us, and if you find that these conversations are helpful to you, sharing is caring, so we always love that. Josh, before we get into the episode today, I had a really nice piece of feedback from a young man in his 20s, and he's about halfway through college right now. And as he had listened to the podcast, he said, you bring up some really good points. And he was kind of talking more about the educational piece of it. He was saying there's so many of my classmates and sometimes myself even, and he's going into an engineering major where he said people almost feel trapped into this particular path because it was either that was what was expected of them, or it's like that's just kind of what you do. Because they don't necessarily know what's the other way to do it. And I think that's one of the reasons why we do this podcast, just to help people rethink and reapproach what they would call their life, and kind of consider another perspective or another path forward.
Yeah, and I mean, I totally agree with that. And I do think that it just gives you a more of a perspective from the other side, maybe, so that you might be able to make a more educated decision for yourself, because not everybody is going to want to do everything that somebody tells them to do.
Right. Part of the beauty of self-discovery is that we're all designed differently, and as those giftings kind of become unlocked in our life, it's always good to know there's other paths available. And I think so many times too we can wrap it up just in our own immediate cultural context that we say, hey, there's other options out there. Just if you travel the world or you go to another place, life is different, even just a different city, and it's kind of a fun experience.
Sure.
Anyway, thank you for those comments, and please keep them coming in. So today's topic, Josh, is the implications of obsolescence. And you sent me a really interesting article, and I took a peruse through. I'm like, this would be a really good thing to kind of start with. Do you want to share that?
Sure. So this article is about the Centennial Light. And it's recognized by the world's longest lasting light bulb. Now you're thinking, oh yeah, how long is that? Since last week when I put it in my my lamp. No, this one has been burning since June of 1901.
That's 118 years old.
Yeah, it's old, and obviously there's times when it wasn't on, but now that it's in this fire station. In Livermore, California, it's actually maintained by the fire department there. It's on a continuous power supply, and it's at a 60-watt light bulb, but burns at about 4 watts. And there has been times when it's like burned a little more and a little less, and they're not really sure why it just keeps going, but it does.
It's the ghost in the machine, Josh.
Yeah. So just so you guys know what we're talking about too, we will post this link to this article on our social media too.
Yeah, it's an interesting article to read for sure. This is kind of proof positive. In this world, I think of light bulbs as very disposable. Only recently, with all the LED lighting that's become available, do you start to think like, oh, hey, this could actually last longer than a month, a week, a year. And of course, like there's light bulbs that are available, but like if we ever wondered like, why can't they make a light bulb that lasts
Well, they
Well,
did.
they did 118 years ago. And so this is really interesting because, around the 30s, 40s, 50s and everything, there were corporations that began to do what's called planned obsolescence. And really what it was doing is trying to stoke commerce and almost keep people in a buying cycle of things. Now, some of that you could say, hey, it's because of innovation, but some of it too is a consumer-driven exercise by companies that wanted them to buy.
And if you think about that, it's almost, we're in a consumerist economy in the United States. So if we don't keep buying stuff, our economy doesn't keep going.
Right.
So I think maybe that these companies realized, well, instead of making one thing and then they can just buy it one time, let's make something that they'll buy, every year for the rest of their lives.
Again and again. So
Yeah.
in context to it, during, after coming out of the Great Depression, and now this is in between World War I and World War II, and World War II was just beginning to bubble up, obviously in the late 30s and things. You had these things, well, how do we get people moving again? How do we move the economy again, right?
Right.
They already knew how to do things well, at least for that particular stage. And they're like, well, what if we didn't do it as well? It sounds funny, but what if we did it well enough that it
Just
lasted?
good enough.
Just
Yeah.
good enough, and you meet the minimum requirement. But that was actually a shift in expectations. My grandpa was, on my mom's side, was a master carpenter. And, I actually stole his jacket. He gave it to me. He had the Carpenters Union on. Always got questions like, well, how did you get that jacket? I'm like, well, that was
Right.
my grandpa that gave it to me. They kind of looked at me funny. But he had this drill. And I thought, Grandpa, why don't you just get a new drill? And that's when I was young. But this thing was around, I think, from the early 30s. And
Sure.
when I saw this thing, it was the late 90s or something. And this thing was still going strong. Now, it was kind of like the one-trick pony. It went forward and it drilled something. But this thing still worked. And that was what was so remarkable. This thing kept working. And so there was actually a company recently that I heard where they built a product so well that they actually went out of business because no one needed maintenance on it, which is a good thing, but a sad thing too if you're the business.
It's like we should fund that company.
Exactly. It's called Curiosity Continuum, ladies and gentlemen.
Yep.
Right there.
Yep.
But I know, like Josh, so your grandpa up in Michigan doing lumber mill work and stuff like that. Like he
Yeah.
had to have tools that lasted, or if he didn't,
Yeah,
he had to fix them.
Yeah, that's true. And he still used until the day he died, or not the day he died, but until he got sick and until he stopped working, they used antique equipment
Because it worked.
And yeah, he has an antique mill operation, which was actually pretty awesome to see. And it was funny because this kind of brings me back just to a quick story. Yesterday, or I think it was maybe a couple of days ago, my wife and I were out watching TV, and they were showing a mill, and it was not the one my grandpa used. It was still considered like an antique mill, but it was newer than what he used.
Oh.
And she's like, "Oh, this is what you did?" I'm like, "No."
Let's
I'm
rewind
like,
it
"This
even
is
more.
much easier than what we did."
Yeah.
But it's just it's almost like if it's not broke, why are we fixing it? Type
Right.
thing.
Sometimes that's a good thing. Sometimes
Right.
it can stifle the innovation piece of it. So there's kind of a counterbalance with it because for your grandpa to do that, he knew how to do it and he was effective at what he did and he was known for his quality. I know you'd shared that as far as like he was known
Yep.
for what he did. There was a lady that I used to work with at a hotel, and she was a really excellent, I think it was a bookkeeper, and everything matched to the penny every single month. And she was doing it on paper until fairly recently. And but then when she switched over, it was a big change for her. And she was near the end of her career too. So it wasn't like, hey, I just got out of college.
Right.
I'm just doing it on paper. But she had to learn to do it there. And it made the paper ledger portion of it obsolete. But what it was so good about the analog process is that it taught her process. There's innovations now.
Right.
Sure, you run it through and do this. But even Curiosity Continuum, like every good venture has a good banker to help them, put checks in and do things. And they showed me their latest branch, and I was really intrigued by it because they had a video screen for customer service on the ATM. And I said, what happens in the event that the internet goes down? And they said, well, we still have a manual process. We just go old school and we'll get it done. And I find it remarkable that even in the age of innovation, you still have to have those things there because analog doesn't go away. Actually, it just the frequency which you use it may change.
And you will if you do not have a process for something, and when you lose power, you will find out.
Yes, you do.
When you lose power, at least I've found out that I find out real quickly where my weak points are in my planning, like very quickly. In this world, when you don't have electric, I mean, it's amazing.
Yeah. There was a gentleman who I know who does a lot of construction and big things like that, and talks to a lot of city planners and things. And one of the major concerns of any like town or municipality or city where you live is always the power grid. And
Sure.
especially in first world situations like we're blessed to be in, you kind of take that for granted.
Oh, you do. You take for granted the constant flow of power, like when I plug something in or turn on a light, that it's going to work.
It just works, right?
Yeah.
That it made like a lot of candles now decorative. It's not like a necessity for you to be able to have light in your home.
Right.
Josh, you just installed a new fan in your office.
I did.
And you said it was a new light bulb that was a special.
Yeah, it was a special LED light bulb that was only 6. It could only be maximum of 6.5 watts. Well, I don't know if anybody has ever tried to find a 6.5 watt light bulb that gives out some kind of decent light, but like at least 900 lumens. Like I wanted something like equivalent to like a 60 watt light bulb of light. I looked for a good 45 minutes at Home Depot through every single light bulb. And like every single light bulb was like the lowest I could find was like 9.5 watts.
Because 6.5 was obsolete to somebody. So
then I finally found a 5.5 one, and I'm like, no, I don't want that low.
Yeah.
So I found it, but it was like there was one option.
Yeah.
One choice.
That's kind of the issue as we continue to innovate and you look at all the obsolete things. Like, for example, I went to the thrift store the other day because there's always gems of the analog things, just old things that are fun. Or, you can actually, for this particular thrift store, you find a lot of great deals on brand new stuff because people just drop stuff off and it's kind of fun. I find Josh some good old retro gaming things in there too sometimes.
Yep.
There was actually an HD DVD player, which obviously lost the war to Blu-ray. And what's so interesting is when you talk about obsolete things, sometimes it loses the standardization war, the adoption war. When you're talking about it, it's like it might not even be the best platform. I mean, VHS was far inferior to Beta, but it won the format wars. So Beta kind of became an obsolete platform.
Yeah, and the same thing with the HD DVD. To my knowledge, that was a better format. It was more quickly adopt. Like people liked it better. They had more options on it than Blu-rays, but Blu-ray just won.
Yeah. So I want to talk a little bit too, using this example of, hey, out with the old, in with the new, and just quickly touch on this idea because living in the United States, if we have like something that's 50 years old, we just think it's like absolutely ancient. Like, oh my gosh, it's 50 years old.
Right.
But then you go to places like China or Europe and they have entire parts of their city that is the old city and the new city.
Yep.
Americans tend to have a very disposable mentality when it comes to just about everything. Like you're rehabbing houses, you're doing this, and no disrespect to people who rehab houses. Our good friend does a lot of kitchen and bath redesign, and he does a killer job. But It's always about making something old new again. And so sometimes you go to cities like London, like Josh, you visited London, like there's total places where there may be modern conveniences to a point, but it's still old. It still functions as old.
Yep. And then there's like the new, for example, like they have the old city where all the things you think of London is there. And then the new city, which is actually quite a distance away. And it's like all the business, all the skyscrapers and everything else is there. So it really does separate it, and it still keeps it the same at the same time. It's very interesting.
Yeah. I think because the United States was founded on people like they're going to go to the new world and do something new. It's almost like that became the mantra. Like we need something new and innovative. And
yeah, I agree with that. I also think it's because there was nothing here. Like big cities weren't here already.
True. Yeah,
So I mean, there were people here. I'm not saying there weren't, but I mean, they didn't have these sprawling metropolises.
yeah. It wasn't a
people,
European model of living. It was
right. It was a different, more agrarian society.
yeah. The thing also that comes to mind with all of this is not only there are things, but there are jobs. I mean, so like how many telegraph operators lost their job after the telephone became the common usage of something? I mean,
Sure,
like,
sure.
there's whole other, but they could have become a telephone operator. One of the things that I've heard recently from a business colleague of mine, he's got 3 sons that are now kind of on their own in the world, and he's got some grandbabies and things. And the encouragement he gave them as they were going into college and things, he goes, find a career where you always need the human component. Because AI,
That's good advice. Yeah.
as shiny and new as it sounds, it's really automating tasks that human beings did to help human beings come back to be more human. So it's funny because there's this weird contrast between the more technological we become, the more we actually need to be human in order to fill in the gaps where technology is not doing that.
Right. And I also would encourage people to think that what you go to school for, maybe not what you always do.
I'm proof positive of that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
But Josh and I are of the generation where the world that we were prepared for didn't emerge. Well, I'll tell you this. Not the way we thought.
Not the way they told us.
Right. And
They
so
told
we're
us we
living
were all
in
going to have
reality.
20-hour work weeks, and
Yeah.
computer was going to do most of my work.
Yeah. Or it's
Right?
like,
But what happened in reality is they took half the people that did my job and got rid of them,
right.
and now I'm doing the work of 2 people or 3 people in 40 hours.
Yeah. And some of those
Or
things
more.
you can,
Yeah.
but some of those things are like, okay,
Right.
got it. You're kind of pivoting. And the world that we're going to live in 20 years from now is going to be very different. The abiding tie is that you will always need to be a human being living in the real world, doing human real world things. Even if you're working on the tech, you're innovating it or something like that. Like, people always need a place to live. People always will have realities that they have to deal with on a regular basis. Keep that in mind, because as long as you keep hey, how am I useful as a human being and unique in how I am as a human being, that's going to make sure you never find yourself on the dusty shelf marked as obsolete, because you will be indispensable in that process.
Yeah, I think this is a great place to put a comma in the conversation, huh, Brian?
I think so too. This is a conversation, obviously, everybody, that could go in a few different directions. If we wanted to spin off, let us know. If you want us to kind of dive down the rabbit hole on maybe a different vertical of this, we'd love to do it for you. Until next time, this is Brian
And this is Josh.
for Curiosity Continuum.